Morning, everybody. Our share this morning is sponsored by Aviva and Marvin Sussman, commemorating the yurtzeit of Aviva's mother, El Solomon Prince Bentheim, coming up on the 20th of Teves. May the neshama have an aliyah, the memory always be for a blessing. And this week we're going to cover a topic I thought maybe to wait a couple of weeks in the Parshios, because it comes up as in Parshas Yisro in just a couple of weeks, but not sure what the schedule will be that week, so we're launching into it now. It's about adultery, not because it's necessarily relevant in any of our lives, and hopefully should not be, but I just saw a headline a couple of weeks ago that adultery is no longer illegal in New York. So that's source number one. I didn't know it was illegal in New York, but adultery is no longer a crime in New York. Governor Kathy Hochul on Friday signed off on repealing a 1907 law prohibiting the act. New York's penal law previously said that a person is guilty of adultery when he engages in sexual intercourse with another person at a time when he has a living spouse or the other person has a living spouse. It was considered Class B misdemeanor, carries a jail sentence of up to 3 months. New York State Senate called the law outdated. Assemblyman Charles Levine wrote the bill overturning the law. He said 13 people were arrested and charged under the law, while 5 people were convicted. The numbers may not be completely accurate due to some court records not being easily accessible. The most recent case was in 2010, but it was thrown out. Okay, I guess good news for the adulterers, bad news for morality. Although a few things caught my attention, and I'm not sure necessarily specific or in terms of how it relates to the law. It says a person is guilty of adultery when he engages in sexual intercourse with another person when he has a living spouse. Is it on the man or the woman or both? Again, pronouns used to be a little bit less fraught than they were today. So the question is it only on the man? Also, this sentence that it's outdated. Outdated from what? From a legal perspective, from a moral perspective? I think he means, kind of from a societal perspective of having the bedroom policed in that way. But still, what does that mean for it to be outdated? Now, in general, it's curious as to, what is the history of adultery as a crime in America. Source number 2, online journal that I think the article was prompted by New York's action. Adultery was at one time a crime in most of the states. It had been a crime as far back as the colonial period. Adultery was punishable by death in Massachusetts Bay. In 1644, a woman who had betrayed her elderly husband was hanged along with her lover. Condemnation of adultery was universal. It was, after all, expressly forbidden by the Ten Commandments. But punishment this extreme was a very rare occurrence. More typical was a New Hampshire statute of 1701, which exposed adulterers to public stigma and scorn and bodily punishment. The offending couple would sit by the gallows in full view of the public with a rope around their necks and then be severely whipped. And I'm wondering if we should put the stockade in front of the shul, what that would be like today. Adultery continued to be a crime in most states after independence, but in at least some of the states, the definition was significantly changed. Adultery in these states was not a crime in itself. The crime was open and notorious adultery. This meant that an occasional fling, a one-night stand, or a visit to a brothel by a married man were no longer crimes. Only adultery that flaunted itself and that was more or less public counted as a crime. The law forbade adultery, in other words, only when it was cast out on the moral code or invited others to violate it. For the rest, after all, the flesh is weak. Or to put matters another way, the purely religious basis of adultery had weakened and been replaced by a social theory, which is something we'll come back to. By the middle of the 20th century, criminal codes were either reformed to reflect changing attitudes towards sexual behavior, or at least changing attitudes about the use of the criminal law to police it, or left on the books but rarely enforced. The famous Kinsey reports claimed that through interview data that adultery was far from a rare event. One by one, the states peeled off adultery from their criminal codes in this period. Trend continued to this day. Minnesota got rid of the crime in 2023. As of 2024, adultery survived as a crime in about 15 states, including New York, until this November. In New York, adultery has been defined as a Class B misdemeanor. In a few states, adultery is classified as a felony, which made it on paper at least a more serious matter. This is true of Michigan and Wisconsin. In Florida, the definition of the crime harkens back to statutes on open and notorious adultery. the crime in Florida consists of living in an open state of adultery. So there you have kind of a brief history of adultery in America, from being hung for violating to something that's a little bit anachronistic from a legal perspective. One thing in particular that stood out when reading this history is this idea that how much was the act versus what was the moral temperature of the times, and as well as trying to encourage and keep things, the law being there so as to maintain a certain moral code or moral standard, and only prosecuting when things were more flagrant. So that is the latest in terms of the latest state of adultery today on a legal perspective, and we'll go into it from a Jewish perspective. Obviously, going through everyone's mind is the seventh commandment, lo tin'af, you shall not commit adultery. But that doesn't really tell us very much in terms of what exactly is involved. As with most aspects of Jewish law, there's the written Torah, there's the oral Torah, there is the rabbinic interpretation of it, as well as the after effects in terms of some of the related outcomes of what happens in terms of one who commits adultery. When is it punishable? What happens? What's the status of a couple where adultery is committed? Can they come back together? What would be the status of a child born out of an adulterous relationship, and the like? So we're going to proceed down and look at some of those issues. Disclaimer: adultery is forbidden. It's bad. And as we'll see, even the way the Torah is introducing it is very much to try and maintain a certain, I guess, moral order, moral code, and to maintain a stronger family dynamic. So, one of the first things that when it comes to lo tin'af, is that you can't commit adultery. The Torah qualifies this in Vayikra 20:10, source number 4, that it's not just the adulterer. Both parties in that adulterous relationship are on the hook for a violation. The ish asher yinaf es ish asher yinaf es ish re'eu, most you must hano'ef v'hano'afes. That it's committing adultery. A man commits adultery with a married woman, committing adultery with another man's wife. The adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Right? Sometimes, as we'll see, as Rashi is going to comment, this idea that when you talk about adultery in the Jewish perspective, many people often will jump in by saying it's only women who can't commit adultery, and that men can have relations with another woman. And so we'll see that that's technically has some truth to it, but both of those involved in the adulterous relationship are liable, and it says the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. Rashi begins to unpack this idea that that technically he says the term ni'uf only applies to the case of a married woman. As it is said, the wife of his neighbor, the noef and the noafis shall be put to death. As it further states, the woman that committeth adultery taketh strangers instead of her husband. Right? There is definitely the idea that a married woman is officially exclusive to her husband. It's not allowed. The woman cannot have multiple husbands. Now, according to Judaism, according to Jewish law, man can have 2 wives, and we'll see, whether can, should, and how that applies in this type of a situation. But the idea, from Rashi, presents that idea that it's only the married woman, who is officially guilty of adultery, because a married man having a relationship with another woman is not adultery technically. But it's important to point out that both the adulterer and the adulteress, both the married woman and whoever she is having that sexual relationship with, are technically liable and officially, if under the right circumstances, put to death. And this is explained in the Sefer HaChinuch, the book of religious instruction, counting the mitzvot. Source number 6, to not reveal the nakedness of a man's wife, to not have intercourse with a man's wife, as it is stated, you shall not commit adultery. And the explanation comes that the undifferentiated expression adultery indicates with a man's wife. As they made them, every less said, he's quoting Rashi, adultery is only with a man's wife. And this negative commandment is repeated in the order achremot, as it says, and to your neighbor's wife. Those are the verses that we saw. And so again, that technically speaking, it's the married woman who's not allowed to have another sexual relationship outside matrimony. That's more restrictive upon her. But it doesn't mean that the person that the married woman sleeps with gets off scot-free. They're both liable for the death penalty. It's just not the exact same terminology. Now, one of the other things that we're going to begin to see from a Jewish perspective is that the idea of any type of sexual relationship outside of marriage is not a good thing. So sometimes people start to get the impression that it's okay for a married man to quote unquote have an affair or sleep around or something of the sort, and especially maybe only this applies to Jewish women. The Sefer HaChinuch says no. The marriage relationship is one that is sacrosanct and is sacred, Jew or non-Jew. Prohibition of a man's wife is from the commandments that are upon all people in the world more generally, whether Jew or whether Gentile. So this is, again, we're not sure how the Jewish law might be enforced by, the outside society, but Judaism recognizes that a non-Jewish married woman is as much a part of this adultery concept as a Jewish woman. And it's not that a Jewish married woman has chuppah v'kiddushin and therefore is religiously more off limits. No, there's a certain morality that exists with regards to the family dynamic that you can't claim that it's different. A husband and wife in Judaism has a certain sacred bond, just like a husband and wife of any person. All the people in the world more generally also have that type of a relationship. And so therefore, to begin to counter this idea that adultery is prohibited, it's more problematic on the woman. No, it's more technically mi'uf applies to the married woman more than to the married man. But the man who sleeps with the married woman in an adulterous relationship is also liable and could be put to death, as well as the fact that it's not just a married Jewish woman, it's a married woman in general, Jew or non-Jew, because we believe that any breaking of the marital bond or any violation of that marital bond is problematic. As an aside, this topic of the marriage being something of a sacred bond more generally, universally, outside the realm of Jew, outside the realm of chuppah v'kiddushin is relevant as to the status of common law marriage. I think we may have covered this once before, that, in general, if you have, we know that the way to get married is chuppah v'kiddushin, a man and a woman, right? The Rambam talks about the history of relationships, and once upon a time, he basically says a man would club the woman over the head and take her home. Doesn't use the exact language, but it's described basically, a man would grab a woman and that's his wife, and then already the Noahide code creates a sacred bond of marriage or between man and woman universally. And then Judaism added chuppah v'kiddushin. And so the question is, if you have a Jewish man and a Jewish woman who don't have chuppah and kiddushin, don't have their marriage sanctified by Jewish law, but they live together, have children together, what would be called in secular society or legal society common law marriage, does Jewish law recognize common law marriage as being Jewishly married as well? So is Jewish marriage only a function of having a Jewish marriage ceremony, chuppah v'kiddushin, or is it creating a family, which is common law marriage? Now, there is what's called in Jewish terminology a nafka mina. There's a practical difference here. Anyone know what that practical difference would be? What case may provide a living example of whether common law marriage is considered Jewish marriage? The case would be whether a Jewish man, a Jewish woman who never had chuppah v'kiddushin, lived together and created a family, decided to separate. And that separation, does that require a get, a Jewish divorce? So on the one hand, maybe if there's no Jewish marriage, there's no need for a Jewish divorce. Or is the common law marriage something strong enough that since everybody knows they're quote unquote married, regardless of what kind of ceremony they had, there would be the need for a Jewish divorce. For example, in Israel, they follow the idea that if there's a man and a woman creating a family dynamic and they have children, even if they got married in Cyprus, the only way for them to separate is with a get, a Jewish divorce. The question comes up, often in situations where you would encounter, maybe less observant or less Jewishly knowledgeable individuals who didn't have a religious or a halachic marriage, and then they want to separate, and then they want to get remarried. So usually what happens when a rabbi sits down to marry a couple, they ask, Jewish, your parents Jewish, your grandparents Jewish, were you ever married before? If you're married before, how did the marriage end? If the marriage ended without a religious divorce, you may end up in a bit of a pickle, and then this question becomes something more complicated. So we're seeing that this idea of what's considered adultery, extends beyond just the Jewish man and the Jewish woman, but into the context of marriage as a concept, or as a binding concept in general. Now, since we're talking about adultery from a legal perspective, we're moving to adultery from a religious perspective. And what does Christianity say about adultery? When it says lo tinaf, what does that mean? So, of course, there are lots of flavors of Christianity, but just from the Catholic perspective, source number 7, adultery refers to marital infidelity, when two partners, of whom at least one is married to another party, have sexual relations, even transient ones, they commit adultery. So it seems that from the Catholic perspective, it doesn't matter to the man or the woman, it's adultery, and I'm sure they have their own outgrowths and further ramifications of that, which can be studied separately. But as opposed to Judaism, which categorizes the adultery sin is a function of a married woman having a sexual relationship outside of marriage. Catholicism views it as if the married man or the married woman is involved in a sexual relationship outside of marriage, is considered adultery. Now, this idea of it of lo tinaf being something that's more about the married woman, when the Chizkuni comments on this on the commandment, he says really he goes in a different direction. Do not argue, whereas it's forbidden to reduce the number of living human beings through murder. There's nothing wrong with increasing the human population, even if you're sleeping with a woman who's someone else's wife. He looks at the order of the commandments. What's the 6th commandment? Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. You're not allowed to reduce the number of living beings. So maybe you're not allowed to sin to reduce the number of human beings. Maybe you can sin to increase the number of human beings by having an extramarital affair and having more children that way. That's not true. And he says the same prohibition also applies to all other prohibited sexual relations. He says lo tinaf, adultery, is the same for men and for married men and for married women. He goes into a different direction than Rashi, than the halachic midrashim and the understanding, and says it doesn't matter. The idea of you're not allowed to decrease the population through murder, and you're not allowed to increase the population through a prohibited sexual relationship, which would include those a married man having if a married man would violate the code, that would also be lo tinaf. That's not the way the halachic route goes in understanding this, but it's just interesting that the Chizkuni therefore was understanding lo tinaf, adultery, religiously, even within the context of both men and married women. Aligning with the source number 7 from the Catholic interpretation. Again, this mostly becomes relevant with regards to the punishment. Right, the idea that, as we saw back in source number 4, the fact that adultery is a capital offense with capital consequences if the sin is committed and then adjudicated and prosecuted according to Jewish law, you could end up with it being a capital offense, the way it was back in the 1640s in America. But so the Chizkuni is now started broadening our conversation in terms of the morality and the outcomes and what emerges from these prohibited relationships, because as opposed to looking at it very narrowly with regards to is it adultery from a technical perspective, no eif, niuf, no eif, no efet, there's the general morality of it all. And there are other Torah verses which present us with the idea that the sexual relationship is meant to be sanctified and not to be sullied or profaned by people, quote unquote, sleeping around, or all other sorts of religious prohibitions. Right? That's the idea of the arayot, the prohibited sexual relationships. And we know that that's a very big deal in terms of sexual morality. We know that, what they call the big three. Right? In Judaism, you're allowed to violate Torah in order to save a life, with the exception of the three cardinal sins: idolatry, murder, and the third is sexual immorality, the arayos. So technically, the idea of if a married woman is told, have this extramarital sexual relationship or be put to death, yeharevi al yavor, person has to be willing to be put to death. So we view that it's not just adultery; it's any of the sexual morality issues, which is why that particular example, a married woman is told to either have a sexual relationship outside of marriage or be put to death. Who is the classic biblical character that seems to challenge this scenario? Who is well, it's actually not written in the text that way, but Howard?
Tamar? No.
Who?
No. Tamar?
Tamar
with
Tamar is an interesting. Tamar is by Yehuda is said basically if she's technically had this type of an affair, she should be put to death. Before there was a Torah, but the rabbis understand that Esther was married to Mordechai, but had a relationship with Achashverosh.
Right.
And how could that happen? Right. So again, it's complicated because the text never says Esther was married to Mordechai, but we treat sexual relationships, and we treat this as part of sanctified, not more than morality. This is part and parcel of who we are. Our relationship with God is sacrosanct. Our respect for life is sacrosanct, and our respect for this the family sexual relationship is also sacrosanct. And we see this in source number 9. Do not degrade your daughter and make her a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry and the land be filled with depravity. Right? What we want the sexual depravity that would exist. What is this? It says, don't degrade your daughter and make her a harlot. How does this happen? So the Midrash asks that question. Source 10. What is that? One's giving his single daughter to his neighbor, not for the sake of marriage, and similarly, her giving herself to this end.
Does Bathsheba apply?
What?
Does Bathsheba apply?
Well, that was a sin, but that gets explained because Bathsheba wasn't technically a married woman, because by the end of the story, her divorce went retroactively into effect before she had the relationship with David. But that, of course, opens up a whole other sort of issues. But in this case, what is this zima? What's considered sexual depravity? This idea, the idea of people sleeping together outside of marriage is considered inappropriate. Whether it be the father, whether the father, tried to create this relationship or facilitating the relationship, again, outside of marriage, or in general for people to engage in this type of a relationship. As the Rambam takes this verse in source number 11, therefore the Torah prohibited this and says, do not defile your daughter with premarital relations. The monetary fine, right? The Torah in other verses says that if a man has a relationship with an unmarried woman, there's a monetary fine if it's a case of seduction or rape. But it's still completely forbidden for them to engage in sexual relations even when they both agree. this prohibition of having relations with an unmarried woman is punishable by lashes. Maimonides is basically saying that there's a certain there's a certain expectation of that the sexual relationship only take place within the context of marriage, and so clearly adultery is taking place outside of that. It is problematic. But even a married man to have a sexual relationship with an unmarried woman, and even if you don't want to call that adultery, that's still a prohibition of having relations with an unmarried woman outside of marriage, punishable by lashes. The idea that people sometimes would say, oh, if it doesn't technically have a violation of adultery, then the Torah must condone it. The Rambam says that's not the case. As well as a desire, another verse later on presents a general also theme of trying to maintain the holiness of the community. You don't want you don't want a woman to be a prostitute. You don't want a man to be a prostitute. This is the idea that people should not be loose when it comes to sexual relationships. As Rabbi J. David Black points out, it follows, therefore, that since Jewish law does not under any circumstances recognize the existence of a matrimonial relationship between a Jew and a non-Jew, the prohibition of Lo Yeh Kadesh is applicable in all cases of intermarriage. Rabbi Black says that basically this verse, which is telling us that there are only permitted sexual relationships within marriage, that means for a Jew to have a relationship with a non-Jew, or when he's writing an article about intermarriage, what's the prohibition against intermarriage? He says, even if you can't find a specific prohibition against intermarriage in the Torah, which is debatable based on some of the verses and explanations, a Jewish man to have a sexual relationship with a non-Jewish woman is a prohibition of source number 12. The idea of yes, you may want to say that intermarriage isn't prohibited by the Torah as intermarriage, but it's prohibited by the Torah by violating the expectation or the requirement to maintain a certain type of sexual norms only within marriage. So the idea of adultery is going further than just whether it be the married woman having a sexual relationship outside of marriage, or even if you want to say it applies to both the husband and the married man or married woman, it goes much more beyond adultery. It's not just if we can escape the problem of adultery, then we can be more sexually liberated or free. That's not the case. Jewish law takes a very dim view and even a prohibited view of these types of relationships. So any questions, comments, or reactions before we look at a couple other, I guess, outgrowths of this topic? So, this idea.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
A woman who is not married has an affair with a man who is not married. Is there any violation there?
So it would seem that there is a violation because from the verses that we saw in source number 9 and source number 12, a sexual relationship outside of marriage is a prohibition. It doesn't have necessarily it's not a capital offense. Should that be something that could be prosecuted? It may not have the communal consequences, which we'll see in a minute, but that doesn't make it a good thing. So it's still against Jewish law.
Get it up and down quick enough.
So, this idea of
get tougher.
This idea of there being a problem of any of a violation, again, for a violation of Jewish law of a sexual relationship. When we talk about it, especially the fact that Jewish married men are allowed to technically have more than one wife, had sometimes opened up a lane for a more permissiveness in that type of a sexual encounter between a married man and an unmarried woman, in line to similar to the question I was just asked. Maybe there's an escape hatch, an escape clause, and this is something that's called pilegesh, concubine. Right? We know that in the Bible there are examples of pilegesh, and it seems that it would in the Talmud talks about the type of a man having a relationship that didn't necessarily have kiddushin or ketubah. What happens, a sexual relationship that didn't follow a religious ceremony or a religious marriage contract, and talks about that situation as a pilegesh. It differentiates between a woman who is a wife who is married with a religious ceremony, act of kiddushin, and a ketubah, marriage document and marriage contract. And what about a woman who doesn't have those prerequisites, but still is living with a man? And it seems to offer that possibility. And this every now and then rears its head, within the Jewish community about that being a way for married Jewish men to have permissible, quote unquote, extramarital affairs. Right? We just got done talking about how any type of sexual relationship outside of marriage is a violation, even if it's not adultery. There are other prohibitions that are violated. But what about the pilegesh exception, which seems to emerge from the Talmud, which appears as a situation where there is a woman without a ketubah or kiddushin living with a married Jewish man? So here Rabbi Blythe addresses this in an article on the subject. He says, source number 14, finally, is not at all clear that concubinage can be sanctioned within the framework of halacha. He quotes a Professor Silberg that notes that the late Sephardic scholar Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Toledano at one time advocated reinstitution of concubinage as a means of ameliorating certain social and halachic problems, but subsequently withdrew his recommendation. Actually, a similar suggestion was originally formulated by Rabbi Yaakov Emden, 17th century, 18th century, in response to the threat posed by the licentiousness of the Sabbatians, followers of the Shabtai Tzvi false messiah. Needless to say, this proposal never gained wide acceptance within the community of rabbinic scholars. So, Rabbi Black is saying the concept exists, and it is generally understood that there could be a situation of a Jewish man and Jewish woman where the wife, and maybe it's the second wife or the additional wife, has joined the household without a chuppah and kiddushin and ketubah, but that's not permission to have this type of external or additional woman, quote unquote, on the side that would be permissible, and that the examples in the Talmud and Halacha of a pilegesh would seem to indicate a situation where a man has a wife who just doesn't have kiddushin or ketubah. And getting back to what we talked about before, that common law marriage is something that Jewish law might recognize, and that situations where this may have been proposed in various times in either the Ashkenaz or Sephardic communities never caught on because it doesn't work. We have such a distaste for the sexual relationship outside of marriage that there's a whole cultural prohibition about it, that therefore to pick on this pilegesh and open it up as a vehicle for men to have dalliances on the side is not appropriate. And the places where it may have been suggested were in very unique and really unfortunate situations when, as like with Yaakov Emden, the licentiousness of the Sabbatians. And so therefore, this pilegesh exception is rejected as a contemporary or a real exception to the rule, and that generally speaking, all sexual relationships, obviously married women, because outside of it would be a violation of adultery, or even married men who can take on other wives. Yeah, if you want to take on another wife, you can have another wife. You can't have another relationship on the side that's not a second formal wife. That wife may not necessarily need kiddushin and ketubah, but it's not this idea of having someone completely separate on the side. And let's face it, nowadays the idea of having one wife has become the accepted norm in Jewish practice. And even with regards to this idea that, that we already start off, the fact that officially adultery is on a married woman who's not allowed to have a second husband, but a Jewish husband is allowed to have a second wife. That second wife was not necessarily something that got a ringing endorsement from the Jewish tradition or Jewish law. Because if you go back to the very beginning, when the husband-wife relationship is introduced in its original form with Adam and Eve, source number 15, By source number 15, Adam and Eve, when after the creation of Eve, it says that a person should leave his father and mother, clings to his wife, they become one flesh. Right? Al ken yazov ish et aviv et imo, v'davak v'ishto v'ayu basar echad. This idea that there's a certain exclusivity that exists, a certain the idea of becoming as one, which exists. And on some level, this has a certain type of reverberation that the ideal relationship is this monogamous, this one husband and one wife, this one spouse. Yes, you have other situations. Right? Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham. Yaakov had multiple wives, but the biblical ideal seems to be man, woman becoming one flesh. And the Aruch HaShulchan points out, right? This is Rabbi Chilmichel Epstein discussing this topic within the Talmudic and Halachic literature. That he quotes Rabbi Yosef Cairo, so into the 16th century, who said, "Tov las os takana b'chochomer al misha yisa yisha al yishto." He says we should have a rule that there should never be someone who marries another wife in addition to his first wife. He says, "Afim komos shalon ispasha takanas v'meido gershom or hagola." Even though even in places where what's called the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom, where Rabbeinu Gershom instituted and prohibited, the idea that anyone who has a second wife is ostracized from the community, which was done about 1,000 years ago. That was done in Germany. So Rabbi Yosef Karo is saying, even in places outside of Europe that accepted this, the Middle East, North Africa, where they didn't know from Rabbeinu Gershom the same way, and some communities maintained multiple wives for much longer. Like some of you may be thinking of the Yemenite community in particular; they were the ones who most recently had more than one wife. He says even those places that never had heard of Rabbeinu Gershom, it's good to have to make this a rule. Why? We never see in rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, the Gemara, throughout the generations, we never hear of any of the rabbis having more than one wife. So we see midrashim that it didn't work out well when this happened. So he says it makes a lot of sense to have one wife, and the idea maybe it is that's the biblical ideal. The fact that people had more than one wife. Avram needed Hagar. Yaakov had multiple wives. He got tricked originally. Other situations that we encounter, those are the exceptions, not the rule or not the ideal. And that's where Rabbi Chaim Jachter sums it up. Moreover, every bigamous relationship described in the Tanakh works out poorly. The Torah thereby communicates to us that a bigamous family structure is unhealthy, inevitably leads to dysfunction. Thus, Rabbeinu Gershom really institutionalized that which was always the Torah vision of an ideal and proper monogamous marital relationship. So this idea that even if you want to say that there is the fact that a married Jewish man has an outlet, and maybe it's an outlet of a second wife, even that's not a good outlet, even that's not an ideal outlet. The idea of trying to maintain this ideal monogamous husband-wife relationship should continue. Questions, comments, and then we'll just give one other kind of outgrowth type of a situation.
I have some, Rabbi.
Yeah.
The whole concept in Judaism of the Jewish marriage versus the civil marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So there was an major incident that I was involved in, where there was a rabbi who gave a get to his wife, but the civil divorce was still active. And he married a woman, and he got out of it because he got someone from out of state. It was in New York. And actually some lawyer called the police to tell them that it's a misdemeanor and he should at least be called on it. And they got out of it because the Masada Kedushin was from out of state, even though the wedding happened in New York. It's to me, it's just another way of getting out of whatever our poor women are suffering as agunot. It's just another bash against women.
The situation you asked about with regard to the civil marriage being recognized as marriage, the common law piece, that only works when they're living as husband and wife type situation.
But it has effects on divorce.
Just with regards to that type of situation that you're describing, there are two aspects to the conversation. One is, are they still married from a
Yes.
Jewish perspective and a civil perspective. From the Jewish perspective, if a get is granted, they're not married anymore. From a, again, what would happen in a situation if they get a get, but they live together and they're still living together? The get is actually not considered valid. But if you have a case just from a technical perspective, a husband and wife are married, and they're getting divorced, and the get is given, and they're not living together anymore. According to Jewish law, they're not married. Now, the idea of being able to remarry introduces, as you pointed out, civil legal repercussions, and then how that plays itself out. Law-abiding people would never allow someone who has a get but not a civil divorce to get married.
No.
In
Right.
terms of if unscrupulous characters are involved.
But you're talking about a civil divorce. You're talking about adultery in civil marriages. That's what Hochul just got rid of. Hochul, whatever. her
Correct.
name is.
Oh, yeah. So on some level,
So-
on some level, the what Hochul just did made it. You saw
Much
the bigamy
easier.
situation.
Right.
You saw so Hochul just removed an impediment that would have existed in theory had it
Correct. So
been
was there
enforced,
any
which is
outcry?
actually similar to the other situation, because in a case where you have someone who has a religious divorce but not a civil divorce, any type of remarriage would be bigamy, right? That's what you said. They called him on it. The official was out of state.
Correct.
But for the most part, you're not going to find any. You're not going to find authorities who will prosecute for the bigamy in this case ever. That's just it's the same way they weren't prosecuting adultery, they're not going to prosecute bigamy in this type of a case, because you don't.
It's a misdemeanor. It was a misdemeanor.
I know,
So
but
it is a mark on a record. It does exist for
Right.
some
No,
people.
but for my experience with me, you won't find the prosecutor will prosecute it.
I'm just curious if any rabbanim spoke about this to Hochul.
Or it's forbidden. Oh, so have they spoken about the Hochul?
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone spoke about the Hochul. Hopefully, on some level, as ineffective as prosecuting adultery has been, is prosecuting bigamy. Right? We're not talking about big love cases of they dramatize and person having multiple families, for example. Those are cases that are much more easy to bring to action items on the secular authorities. But the case here, in addition to all the other, all the other improper activity, generally speaking, at least when I've spoken to attorneys, if you have a case that you described where the get was given and they're not living together and the husband remarries religiously, you're not going to find a prosecutor who's going to want to tackle the issue from bigamy, because it's, then you get into church and state, and no one really wants to go down that path. But in terms of, I don't think they're going to take bigamy off the books, but tightening up the statute in this type of case, which involves also it would involve the state kind of passing judgment on a religious situation, probably won't happen either.
I'm just curious.
Rabbi.
Look, bad people do bad things, and that's the overall concept of the fact that it's the husband that initiates the get, in terms of you talk about in terms of there being the possibility for women being at a disadvantage. I guess the more was expected for the men to do the right thing, but that unfortunately isn't always the case.
Okay, thanks.
Isn't it illegal to get married in New York, to get married religiously without a civil
Correct.
marriage?
That's also illegal, but they don't prosecute that either, for the same reason. Right, officially speaking, if you have if a rabbi officiates at a religious ceremony that does not involve a civil union at the same time, it's technically illegal. But it's not something that will get prosecuted, because you're starting to, then it's the state interfering. At some point, the response will be, well, I'm religious and this is what I did. And people don't want to go down that path. I just, a couple of weeks ago, I ended up, there was a couple that stopped by. Not even, one that I knew them from, now they weren't local, but they were from the county local, and they had gotten a religious ceremony, but the marriage license that they got from the clerk's office had not yet been activated because it has to be 5 days after, and their chuppah was like 3 days after, so they couldn't have it filled out then. And they kind of then forgot about it, and then before, I think you have like a certain number of days depending on the jurisdiction. I think they had like 3 months. This marriage license was good 3 months after it was issued, before it would expire. So it was like 2 days before it expired. So they came by and I say, do you take so-and-so? Do you take so-and-so? And you can kiss the bride. And it was all very nice. I told the husband he now has 2 anniversaries that he has to give his wife a present. But no one's gonna prosecute the rabbi for having not officiated with the civil ceremony.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
is there a double standard here where a man can have several wives like Abraham, but a woman can't have several?
So that's
husbands?
the idea that from a technical legal perspective that exists, but from an aspirational, religious, moral, spiritual value, that's to be frowned upon, certainly nowadays. Right? It gets into the larger conversation of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. I always like to quote Rabbi Norman Lamb, who said about the subject that the letter of the law is the body and the spirit of the law is the soul. And if you have the soul, the spirit of the law without the body, it's a ghost and it floats and it's not anchored in reality. But if you have the letter of the law without the spirit of the law, you have the body without a soul, you have a corpse. It's dead. So, you have those who will put all the emphasis on one and not the other. And in both cases, it's something that's incomplete. At the end of the day, Judaism gives ways, tips the balance, tips the scales in favor of the letter of the law. But I think the Jewish tradition makes a very strong case for a monogamous marital ideal. And for those who want to live within the letter and spirit of the Jewish tradition, certainly the way it's understood from that verse, and certainly the way that the Aruch HaShulchan and others understand it, it's very much traditional to say, one husband, one man and one woman. That's the ideal Jewish marital relationship.
Fires in Southern California. Tennis Channel is partnering with the Salvation Army to provide assistance for those affected.
Just a little bit of background noise. Let's go back to that. And yeah. So one other aspect of this, that plays out, and what are the consequences if you have a situation where we're back to the classic case of adultery was committed. And there's a discussion in Jewish law that if a husband and a wife, and the wife has an extramarital affair, can she remain married to her husband? Or sometimes this is the type of situation that leads us to go down the sota path, right? The suspected wife and the like, and one that would have a greater consequence. What if a child was born in this relationship? A married woman has a child from a relationship with a man other than her husband. That's what we call the mamzer, right? Source number 18, the Mishnah Yevamah presents it. Rabbi Yeshua says, relations with anyone with whom one is liable to capital punishment produces a mamzer. We said at the beginning that that adultery is a capital offense. So if a child is born out of that prohibited relationship, the child is a mamzer, right? Some people translate mamzer as illegitimate. Illegitimate is not the best translation, because sometimes out of wedlock is also illegitimate. Out of wedlock is not the definition of a mamzer. Mamzer, like the Mishnah says, has to be born from a relationship that would have been liable to capital punishment, produces a mamzer. So how do we handle those types of situations? On some level, and we see this from the Talmud in source number 19, we're not so interested in investigating this to its fullest conclusion. Right? Even though there is this consequence of mamzer which can emerge from this prohibited relationship, which is something that's only, getting to Aviva's point, is something that only applies to the consequence of the woman's action, not the man's action. But Rav Tachlifa from the West, who was from Israel, taught before Rabbi Avu, if a married woman engaged in adulterous sexual intercourse, her children are considered of unflawed lineage. Right? That means they're not mamzer. Why? As most instances of sexual intercourse are attributed to the husband. And consequently, it's presumed that the children were conceived by the husband and not by the paramour, not by the forbidden relationship. Therefore, the daughter of a woman suspected of promiscuity is not suspected of being a mamzer. This idea that even though these situations happen, we assume that most people are doing the right thing. And since most people are doing the right thing, we're not going to try and investigate specifically to uncover an illegitimate situation or a child born out of wedlock or this type of a sinful relationship. And in many ways, while the Judaism, while the Torah, while Jewish religion sets very high expectations for the relationships, we only want the sexual relation to take place within the context of marriage. But we know that that people are flawed, sins will be committed. At the same time, we don't want to investigate those sins or carry them forward. And even this gets discussed, a type of a situation where maybe the woman had the extramarital affair, maybe she didn't. We're not going to investigate. We assume if she's pregnant with a child, we're not going to wonder whether that child was born from the illicit sexual relationship or not. We're going to assume most people have relationships with their spouse, and this is how we want it to continue. We don't want to dig down too deeply, right? People talk about, what about DNA testing and the like? Should we try to uncover? Or what if the DNA testing uncovered something wrong? This is an example where you don't want the DNA test or evidence to be dispositive and prove one way or the other, because these are significant, severe consequences that emerge because the mamzer that emerges in this type of relationship has, is scarred, quote unquote, scarred for life from that type of a consequence. And the Jewish law does as much as possible to try and not look that directly in the eye in order to try and maintain the mamzer not becoming a mamzer, being able to be part of the Jewish community, marry whomever they want. And even if we can identify, we basically try not to identify. The Shulchan Aruch mentions that if someone knows of a situation where someone might, a child was born in a situation where there would have been a prohibited relationship and it might be a mamzer situation, it's forbidden to raise the issue. Because sometimes we don't want to know, we don't want to go further down. And I think that this was meant to be at least an effort at a corrective. We realize that there's certain situations that very much disadvantage someone. In the case of the moms, it disadvantages someone who didn't have a say in the matter. So we're going to try our best to find a corrective. Obviously, at some points we're stuck. But the idea is that what begins as lo tinaf, do not commit adultery, which may have been the onus specifically of that particular sin based on one. Well, both of the partners, the noef and noafis, are both technically liable for execution if convicted. And then Jewish law has another whole aspect of maintaining the holiness of the community by prohibiting sexual activity outside of the marital relationship, as well as recognizing that some of those exceptions or exceptions to the rule that may allow the husband, who's not the same status as the wife, because the husband can have more than one wife, to have other vehicles for these exceptions, tries to recognize that these are not ideal. They exist, and in some level, there's a little bit of remorse that they exist, whether it be that pilegesh exception, which Rabbi Black says is forbidden from a practical perspective, whether it be the fact that having multiple wives might be a technical allowance, but certainly not an ideal. And when these situations do unfold, we don't want to investigate, we don't want to uncover them, and to hold as much as possible to not hold the quote unquote guilty parties as accountable, so that we can hopefully try and maintain the family dynamic. So it may be legal in New York, but still very much forbidden in Jewish law, and still very much an aspect that part of maintaining a more elevated and exalted Jewish family dynamic. There are exceptions, there are bad actors, but there's certainly this aspiration.
Rabbi, homosexual men cannot get me married, I imagine.
Well, the issue of homosexual man, everyone has a choice. Meaning it doesn't mean not get married. Jewish men can marry Jewish women, whether they're gay or straight. Now, whether they should or not is a separate discussion. But that's what individual sexual preferences is not a prerequisite for technically getting married.